Good afternoon, everyone. Fisgurma, I hope you are all well. Thank you for attending today's talk and panel titled Decolonizing Multilingualism, delivered by the Bilingual and Multilingual Education Interest Section. Ismisha Palmiachan Shiblo, Shigale Ahunum, Rugagas Holchemi, on Glasuhu on Nullipa, Agus Hayan Urango, Avi Abrin Rave and Jew. My name is Paul Megan. I am the chair of the interest section, and I am a Scottish Gaelic social linguist. It's a pleasure to have you all here with us today to join our esteemed panel speakers. Today, this panel will be exploring ways in which we can advocate for and action a more inclusive, equitable, and linguistically and culturally diverse TESOL. The panelists we have today are internationally renowned applied linguistics and TESOL experts who will share their expertise from diverse contexts globally and implications from their work and research. This panel is recommended for both TESOL practitioners and researchers who, in any educational setting, who wish to learn more about how to include decolonizing and culturally inclusive approaches in multilingual TESOL. Now, I'd just like to take a moment to introduce you to the TESOL BMEIS leadership team this year. We all advocate for multilingualism, cultural and linguistic diversity, and dynamic approaches to bi- and multilingual education in TESOL. I would just like to say it's an absolute honor and privilege to work alongside such stellar scholars, practitioners, researchers, educators, and activists. I'm very grateful to be part of this team, and I'm very grateful to you all for taking the time today to join us and our panelists for this talk. Thank you. Morantang. Just some overview of the event and the schedule for today and some Zoom etiquette, please. Keep yourself muted during the panel and when panelists are talking. Each panelist will present for approximately 15 minutes, up to 17 or 18 minutes, and there will be approximately 15-minute Q&A session at the end. You are welcome, of course, to insert any comments or questions into the chat box as we go through the presentation, and at the end, I will endeavour to get round to those questions and posing them to the panelists. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first panel speaker today. Dr. Madoka Hamine works as an associate professor at the Faculty of International Studies in Mayo University in Japan. She received a PhD degree from the Faculty of Education at the University of Lapland in Finland in 2020. Her research interests include, but are not limited to, heritage language teaching and learning, identities and emotions of second language learners, Indigenous education, and language policy and planning and language pedagogy. I'm just going to pass the floor now over to Madoka, who will introduce herself and the talk today. And before I do that, I'd just like to, again, welcome our esteemed panelists. Thank you to every one of you. I'm very grateful for your time and for sharing your expertise with us today. And thank you, everyone who is here. Please enjoy. Thank you. Over to you, Madoka. Thank you very much.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Kuyomanara. Panaya Madoka, Hamine Madoka did answer you. Kyuya Pantaharanaka, Oritabori Mihayu. Okay. Everyone, hello. I am logging in from Japan. And today I'm talking about Tears of Earth for this panel. And I will focus on my current work that I am working in the Indigenous language revitalization and reclamation projects. So Tears of Earth, the title of this talk, is named after from this art, which was displayed on Okinawa Island last November, as a demonstration of land reclamation and decolonization of our islands. In last November, this work was created by Mr. Yara, but 2 weeks after, the work was destroyed by somebody. And this is a image that I wanted to show today as a way to show that when we are doing language work, language reclamation, it's something that is very difficult to restore. And this artwork is also one kind of metaphor that shows that something was broken and we are working to restore it. So language reclamation is related to multiple ways of knowledges, understanding the well-being of people and individual and social justice. And also, Leonard 2012 shows that there is also a need to understand and recognize internal diversity of speakers. And it kindles positive emotions and also community health, individual health. On the other hand, because of the historical domination and assimilation of by the dominant language groups, people who are working on language reclamation often experiences trauma and tensions. So today, the content is going like this. So I'm working on the language revitalization in the place called Ryukyu Islands. So for some of you who don't know where it is, this is the map of the Ryukyu Islands. They lie between Japan and Taiwan. And so the languages of Ryukyu Islands have many varieties within. For example, in Okinawa, where I am now, we have, this is research in 2017, but it shows 400 different varieties within Okinawa. So this shows that indigenous language is not, the language varieties are many, and that makes it also difficult to select which language should we focus and reclaim. So this is the Okinawa and Yaeyama Islands that I am presenting on today. My work is basically into Okinawa and Yaeyama Islands. So historically, Okinawa was an independent kingdom, which was a separate nation from Japan. And 1895 to 1936, there was Japanese sovereignty and top-down standardization of the language. So during that period, it was a bilingual state, and gradually the language accelerated, language shift occurred, and standardization also occurred. And we were also under US occupation after the World War II. So during the period of US occupation, the government of the US actually tried to make Ryukyuan languages official language of the Ryukyus. But because of the occupation, people in the Ryukyus wished to be part of Japan. And now we are part of Japan. And now there are many language revitalization activities. And this project is a research project that I am funded by a Japanese Science and Promotion Society and called Becoming Indigenous Language Speakers. And I'm focusing on how do new speakers experience and shape process of language reclamation. So language reclamation happens in multiple places. And I'm focusing on emergent multilingual speakers and learners of indigenous Ryukyuan languages. And sites of reclamation varies. I do field work in communities, schools, homes, and local community centers, as well as online language reclamation places, site. So let's move on. Okay, so methodology, I'm focusing on the indigenous research method. And it's in indigenous research method, spirituality is part of the work. So indigenous research is spiritual and it's participative. And we have to think about not only the people, but also land and also the environment beyond the language. And this yuntaku is an active form of listening practice that we have in Ryukyu Islands. And this is a indigenous method rooted in Okinawa Ryukyuan spirituality. So what is yuntaku? Yuntaku is a method which is listening and chatting and talking. And the important part of yuntaku is a circle. So circle is very, very strong. It doesn't begin, it doesn't have a start, it doesn't have an end. So yuntaku, it starts, it doesn't start like very clearly. Somebody start yuntaku somewhere. And this is a yuntaku that I use for my research. So in my language reclamation work, we sit in a circle with elderlies of the community, and we sit together with new speakers and emergent multilinguals. And in these circles, we study language, we speak and share our stories in the language of the islands. Okay. So yuntaku is as I said, it's an active form of listening. It's not only talking. There is no hierarchy. There is no strict timeline. It starts with somewhere and it ends when we realize it's all finished. So it's a very, very rooted in the Ryukyuan community. So this one session of yuntaku, I have a picture here. Okay. So yuntaku as a methodology of chatting and sharing. I had a workshop recently in the community center, and I asked people to bring objects that represent their language for them. And during the object sharing, a lot of people brought local crafts and also kitchen utensils and local food as part of their language work. So today I'm sharing some of the results from the workshop and yuntaku sessions. So from indigenous language acquisition perspective, I found some of the obstacles for new speakers or learners to learn or reclaim indigenous languages, which I find one of the obstacles is linguistic purism and standardization. So as I shared, there are many linguistic varieties within the Ryukyuan languages. So when new speakers or emergent bilinguals start learning local language, they sometimes get comments like this. So one person shared that I was told that you should use the true yayaman. So what is the true yayaman? 綺麗な old traditional yayaman. That's the idea about linguistic purism. You have to use the oldest form of yayaman, otherwise you are wrong. Another collaborator shared that native speakers of the Ryukyuan languages, they are much stricter with community members, and they get angry at me. Get angry at me. So sometimes native speakers, they tend to be much stricter to the insiders of the community rather than for the outsiders, like people who don't have roots in the Ryukyus. And one other person shared that I am scared to use it because some of the people in the South tell me that Southern dialect is the standard language. So here another ideology of standardization that sometimes hinders the indigenous language acquisition in the Ryukyu communities. Another obstacle that people encounter is a linguistic insecurity. So linguistic insecurity is expressed as a discomfort or anxiety when speakers use their own language, and sometimes they have their own evaluation of their way of speaking. So one person shares that because we have a complicated system of honorifics in Ryukyuan languages, especially from the elders, when the younger person uses honorific incorrectly, it's very rude for elders. So they started using Japanese instead because they feel that they cannot use honorifics correctly, and it's considered inappropriate. Another person shares that sometimes their family members, like in this case, husband, tells me that you should not learn Okinawan because English is better. And sometimes their family member has experience of how proud they are to be like Japanese. So that could be some obstacles that indigenous language learners experience. Okay. And sometimes people feel embarrassed because even if you are from the island, you don't speak the language. You are supposed to know the language, but you don't speak it. And sometimes when the people from outside, they learn it very quickly because they don't have historical connection or historical trauma that people here might have. So in order to overcome these kind of obstacles, people are engaging in resilience and audacity. So some people starting using the language with their family members gradually. And this was a comment that I got that, oh, don't get discouraged even if you are scolded. You have to smile and keep going. And then sometimes when they don't feel like talking to other people, they can just talk to yourself in the indigenous language. And one of the new speakers shared that people say that our languages are extinct or endangered, but our language is not dead because I am here. I exist. So this is the conclusion. So from indigenous language acquisition, we can conclude that we are re-engineering social support system through Yuntaku circles. And we are also decolonizing knowledge systems, being critical. Why is it so difficult for us to learn our languages? And learning knowledge from the ancestors which has been discredited and ignored. And lastly, it's also connected to the history of the land and surrounding environment like ocean. So Yuntaku as an active form of listening. It shares that there is a intergenerational violence, inequalities, but it also transforms experience beyond particular space and time. So decolonization of indigenous language through relationship between place, time, and space. And now, finally, the last quote is from Hau Oha in 2008, that past is not past. Past is in front of us. Past is alive in us. And we are also part of our history. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Hamine. That was so wonderful, illuminating, enlightening, and heartwarming, and many more things. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. As I mentioned before, please do feel free to comment, interact. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them into the chat box, and then we can come to them at the end in the Q&A session. So thank you again, Dr. Hamine, for your wonderful talk today.
Thank you for listening.
Hey, and moving forward, our next panelist is Dr. Sarah Hopkins. Dr. Sarah Hopkins is lecturer at the University of St. Andrews. She has previously worked in the United Arab Emirates, Canada, and Japan. Her research interests include language and identity, multilingualism, translingual practice, linguistic ethnography, and linguistic landscapes. She has published widely in journals and is the author of The Impact of Global English on Cultural Identities in the United Arab Emirates and co-editor of Linguistic Identities in the Arab Gulf States. Thank you, Dr. Hopkins, for being here with us today. I'll pass the floor over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul, for that introduction. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, that's great. So my talk is about decolonizing educationscapes in EMI contexts. And I'll start by giving an overview of what you can expect from this presentation. I'll start by talking about the decolonizing lens. I'll then explain what English medium education in multilingual university settings is. I'll then give a brief context to the UAE and its linguistic ecology. And then I'll explain my ethnographic study of a UAE educationscape, share some findings, and end with some implications and recommendations. So decolonizing has become a very popular concept to use in recent publications. You can see here a variety of books that use decolonizing in their titles, and they span a wide range of domains. So there are books on decolonizing ethnography, wellness, education, methodologies, maps, trauma work, museums, journalism, childhoods, the body, design, and politics. Decolonization is not a static condition or an individual attribute or a lineal point of arrival, but rather decolonization seeks to make visible, open up, and advance radically different perspectives and possibilities of existence, thought, and analysis. Essentially, decolonizing aims to decouple aspects of life from the legacy of colonialism. So to look at decolonizing in the field of education, I'd like to start with this quote from a novel by Nisha Dolan. And the novel is about an English teacher teaching in Hong Kong. And this English teacher called Ava is very critical of the environment in which she teaches. And she takes a decolonizing lens towards her teaching. She says, I'd comment on the learning materials. The illustrations were of white children braving weather conditions that would never occur near the equator. We branded a mistake any usage that might hint a Hong Konger was from Hong Kong. Here she's problematizing the native speaker norms that are used, or the English that is standardized in British and American contexts that is used for the textbooks and materials in this context, and the fact that world Englishes are essentially ignored in this context. She's also problematizing the fact that often white is used as a proxy for English. So to look at the context of my study, it is an English medium instruction university, and you can see the definitions of what EMI means in the blue box. Essentially, EMI language policies aim to equip students with English as a lingua academia, and to produce neoliberal subjects who will boost university rankings. But often in this neoliberal agenda, larger issues are overlooked, such as the need to foster translingual identities, culture, and belonging in multilingual university spaces. And as knowledge concerns embodied, effective, social, and cultural learning that draws from and transforms environmental and geopolitical spaces, whole university ecosystems, including schoolscapes or educationscapes, are important to consider. So rather than using EMI, which just focuses on instruction, a more expansive term to use is English medium education in multilingual university settings. And this term looks not only at instruction, but also at social contexts within the university, and also research cultures and spaces outside the classroom. The decolonizing lens has been applied within sociolinguistics and beyond. It's been applied in literature, also in educational policy, pedagogies, EMI, academic publishing, and multilingualism. But there are very few studies which look at decolonizing in educational spaces, linguistic landscapes, and semiotic landscapes of universities. So to briefly explain the context of the study, this is the UAE. And while the UAE doesn't share the same formal colonial past as Hong Kong, it was a previous British protectorate from 1892 to 1971. And it was considered an informal colony because it was known as the Trucial States. Multilingualism has mushroomed in the UAE because of waves of migration, oil wealth, fast-paced development, and globalization. And now 88.5% of the population are foreign residents. And English is used as a lingua franca together with Arabic, and higher education in the UAE is dominated by EMI. The UAE has a complex linguistic ecology, and you can see in this chart the different elements. Often there's diversity within the Arabic language because of diglossia. So there are various types of Arabic which are used, such as Classic Arabic, Modern Standard Arabic, and Khaliji dialects. And this can often be affected by varied schooling backgrounds, whether it be English medium instruction or Arabic medium instruction. Another common characteristic of language use in the UAE is translingual practice, especially amongst younger Emiratis and especially if attending English medium international schools. Often there's a third space which emerges amongst translingual individuals where notions of belonging are complex and multi-layered. The UAE is an under-researched context which falls outside dominant weird contexts or weird research perspectives. That's Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic. So because my study uses linguistic landscaping as a method, I adopt several new directions by using this method. And these directions were put forward by Shahami and Pennycook in 2022. And they recommend taking a geopolitical, semiotic, ethnographic, and pedagogical angle on linguistic landscaping studies. So as a consequence, more linguistic landscaping studies are taking place in the global south, focusing on broad semiotics, using ethnographic approaches, and also focusing on educational possibilities. But most schoolscapes or educationscape studies have primarily focused on primary schools in European countries, and fewer have taken place in English medium education in multilingual university settings, especially outside weird contexts. So the study, this is the setting. It was a large government university with campuses in Abu Dhabi and Dubai. The campus that I conducted the study on was in Abu Dhabi, and it had a male and a female side, and the study took place on the female side. Students are mainly Emirati, with Arabic as their first language and English as their second, and faculty are from a range of different countries, and you can see a picture of the outside and the inside of the university here. The research questions: how are languages and semiotics used in the university educationscape? And what are university students' perspectives on their educationscape with regard to linguistic inclusion, belonging, and identities? The study had three main phases. The first was a walking ethnography, which took place at 7 a.m. This was the quietest time at the university, and the purpose of this walking ethnography was for me to capture signs in the university and also language objects. And I took pictures of 482 different signs. The second phase was another walking ethnography that took place at the busiest time in the day, which was the lunch hour. And this was to observe interaction. So how did faculty and students interact with the signage, and also to ask specific questions about signs I didn't have access to. And the third stage was gaining students' perspectives via the Padlet app, which is an interactive bulletin board. So if we look at the step which includes gaining students' perspectives, here you can see a screenshot of the Padlet that I used. So I selected 40 pictures from the larger corpus, and I chose signs that represented all the different areas of the university, also different functions and different linguistic repertoires. So monolingual, bilingual, multilingual signs. And I wanted to gain students' interpretations of the semiotic and linguistic landscapes as intertextual products, connected with identities and levels of belonging. 28 third-year students took part in this study, and they were aged 19 to 26. Their participation was optional and anonymous, and I used nexus analysis and thematic data analysis to analyze the data. So these are the themes from the study, and I'm going to go over very briefly each one. So the first was that there was a dominance of English in the linguistic landscape. So most signs were bilingual or monolingual, but when they were monolingual, they were mainly English only. And you can see one sign here is handwritten. I went to pray, I'll be back in 10 minutes. And this was written by an Arabic-speaking administrator, and it was written for students who had Arabic as their first language, but the sign maker chose only to use English. Also, all the classroom signs are only in English with some Braille, but no Arabic. And some imported items like recycling bins only appeared in English, and this could have been because they were imported from Anglophone countries, and they don't have any Arabic on these items. But perhaps more surprising is the sign, the fourth sign here, which was created by students at the university, and it's the counselling centre. And the signs are quite detailed, but they're only in English. And students commented on the Padlet that they thought it would be better if the signs were in English and Arabic. A second theme was imbalanced side-by-side bilingualism, or two solitudes. And you can see the first sign here shows a bilingual sign telling students not to enter the faculty washroom. But the English is very simple. It says students not allowed. But the students commented that the Arabic was much more detailed and quite disrespectful, because it said that the ID would be taken if students entered without permission, and she would get a warning. And so this fits Michael Chestnut's and team's term, multilingual commanding urgency. So this is where an additional language is added to a sign, but it's not inclusive or welcoming. It's the opposite. So it's targeting a certain speech group in order to warn them not to do something. So this could be seen as an example of that concept. The second sign has English and Arabic. It's the first floor sign, but the first floor is written in very big letters in English, but the Arabic is much smaller. But students, when they commented on this on the Padlet, didn't really notice this imbalance, but they just felt that it was very useful because there are different naming conventions around floors internationally. The third sign, you can see side-by-side bilingualism, because one sign is bilingual and the other sign is only in English. And the sign that's only in English takes a cultural reference from the UK because it was a former World War II poster that's been adapted. And students commented they felt that both posters should have been translated. When we look at how students make their mark on the university space, there are signs of translanguaging, whereas top-down signs were either monolingual or bilingual and separated. Students have a much more authentic way of representing their identities in the space. This was a large sculpture, like a language object, which was in the social space of the university, and it spelt out the word happiness. And students were encouraged to decorate the sign. And you can see there are many different languages used here: Chinese, Portuguese, there was some Russian, there are images, Arabic, English. The languages are much more fluidly used. So this is represents students stamping their identities, their linguistic identities on the space. Another sign of students' levels of belonging in the space can be seen through the notion of third spaces and sticky places. A sticky place is Sarah Ahmed's concept, which looks at places or objects that are familiar, that bring comfort, and that carry a shared memory of histories and things. And most of the shops in the university were imported. So, for example, Starbucks, or there was a Deb's Cafe. And so the signs were translated into Arabic, so English first, Arabic second. But this one is an exception, and this is Dukan Cafe. which has been transliterated into English, and in Arabic it means a traditional grocery store. And this cafe represents a sticky place because there's a lot of translanguaging on the items in the cafe, like the cup you can see here with English words like amazing, perfect, but also Arabic words like the name of the cafe or shop, Dukan, and karak, which is a tea, which is common in the UAE, and the henna'd hand, which is a traditional design, an old-fashioned design on the cup. Also, the menu you can see is very translingual and transcultural. Also, students would continue old traditions in the English medium space. So, for example, traditionally, students, if someone in their community passed away, then they would write a note wishing that person well in the afterlife. And so this has been done in the university space. You can see a handwritten note here. So just briefly to conclude, through a decolonizing approach, translanguaging needs to be embraced and recognized as a social fact, rather than being associated with the emotion of guilt in educational domains. Moving beyond the critical trans era in classrooms, translanguaging, third spaces and sticky places can be actively promoted in English medium education scapes with the purpose of empowering translingual identities, increasing levels of belonging, countering monolingual ideologies, and decolonizing multilingualism. A decolonizing approach to the analysis of education scapes highlights the linguistic hierarchies or pecking orders seen via linguistic and semiotic representation. On a practical level, having students take part in critical linguistic landscape projects can help create a forum for change, with the aim of bridging the gap between English-only expectations and translingual identities. If you're interested in reading more about decolonizing, my current university has a very good podcast where a group of scholars explore the concept of decolonization in various contexts. And also the work that I've presented today, I'm currently preparing for a Cambridge element. So please watch out for that. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Hopkins. Again, another really fascinating and illuminating and educational talk about the context in the UAE. And I particularly appreciated the call for this inquiry into critical linguistics landscape as well. I think there's a lot that can emerge from that and the agency of the students in their translanguaging practices as well. So thank you so much again for joining us today and for sharing your expertise. Wonderful. Let's continue. And as I said before, please do feel free, as you are doing, to insert any comments, any questions that you may have into the chat box. Our next panelist is Dr. Prem Fayak. Dr. Fayak is an associate professor of language education in the International and Comparative Education program at Teachers College, Columbia University. Taking critical and decolonial perspectives, Dr. Fayak investigates how language policies and pedagogies construct, reproduce, and transform colonial ideologies and social injustices. He is an associate editor of Diaspora, Indigenous, and Minority Education Journal, and he has co-authored a book, Engaged Language Policy and Practices, and co-edited one volume, Multilingual Education in South Asia at the Intersection of Policy and Practice. Thank you so much, Dr. Fayak, for joining us, and I'll pass the floor over to you. Thank you.
Can you see my screen, Paul?
Yes, we can. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you, Paul. And thank you everyone for joining us today. My talk is writing a grammar of decoloniality in multilingualism in education. So let me begin with my positionality. I come from this Yaktung, and also known as dominant Limbu indigenous and community from the hills of eastern Nepal. And yeah, I'm a multilingual speaker. I grew up speaking Yaktung, which is my first language, a mother tongue, in my childhood. But the language was officially banned in my schools. So I'm critical applied linguist who is really interested in multilingual education, social justice, and language policy from decolonial perspectives. So with this positionality, I will basically talk about how we can reimagine multilingualism in education, basically from a decolonial perspective. So I begin with acknowledging these two books that I think that were published in the same year, 2014, and basically arguing the multilingual tone in SLA and TESOL, very critical about how SLA theories have reproduced very colonial monolingual biases in TESOL, and of course in applied linguistics as well. While there is an increasing growth in scholarship in the field of multilingual education, there are questions around how these, the growth in the scholarship is actually being implemented in practice, and particularly for indigenous communities. As we discuss this idea of multilingualism, Jan Blomat actually reminds us how this discourse of multilingualism is basically reproducing northern perspectives on order, purity, and normality. So that Blomat and colleagues actually call dangerous multilingualism. And this dangerous multilingualism actually leads to the discussion of decolonizing multilingualism. So basically the colleagues, Phoenix Drovu and Leketi Makalela, critically examine how the discourses, basically the mainstream conceptions of multilingualism in Africa, is reproducing the colonial matrices of the power. So again, what they discuss basically is how multilingualism is reproducing northern perspectives of language as a fixed autonomous entity, and focusing more on not really questioning on the hierarchy and power of languages, and seeing language as very separate entities, right? In a way, at the deeper level, multilingualism is still seen as a problem and deficit, and that is actually constantly reproduced in language education or language in education policies. That leads to understanding how decolonizing multilingualism is important, how we need to problematize the mainstream conceptualization of multilingualism. So I see decolonizing multilingualism as two projects. Of course, they are interlinked. So one is, of course, it is an ideological project and an epistemic project. So together, they question and unpack colonial ideologies and their impacts in the lives of indigenous communities or the people, immigrants, and the people of color. And it is also the project of recentering language practices and the ways of knowing and doing and being with diverse language practices. And I'm really interested in understanding how we can write a different grammar of decoloniality, as Walter Mingler talks. It basically refers to using different vocabulary and syntax and semantics to describe alternative ways of knowing, doing, and being with multiple languages and language practices. So my context is Nepal. There are 124 named languages as documented in census. Multilingual education policy, including mother tongue education dominated by the discourse, language rights discourses, exists in policy, but in practice, the historical domination of Nepali as a national language and English as an international language, both as a subject and medium of instruction, is still reproduced in schools through teacher training, through curriculum, through textbooks, through assessment. And as a result, the indigenous languages are still not really having their spaces in education. So then I report how do I work with two different communities, the communities of teachers and communities of indigenous youths and elders. So that's how I discussed how I'm writing a grammar of decoloniality in language education. The first step in the writing of grammar of decoloniality in language education, particularly in multilingual education, is decolonial praxis. So I'm framing it from more bottom-up perspective. So the first thing is diversifying the ways of doing, knowing, and learning languages. So rather than starting off with textbooks and more structural constraints, for example, schooling, curriculum, and assessment, it is really important to see what are the opportunities that we can explore and work with communities outside of the institutional constraints. For example, this is one of the projects that I have been working with indigenous youth for 2 years. The first one is, it's called Land-Based Pedagogy with Yakthung indigenous youths. So in this project, I see land and forest as a curriculum. It's not the textbook or the official written policies as a curriculum, but land and the forest. And then Tongsing, which is a Limbu Yakthung word, which is literally coming together. So which is a pedagogical approach, which basically includes oral practices. And the plants are seen as epistemic resources. In this process, the Tumyangs, who are community elders, become epistemic subjects, and they tell the whole stories around each plant. And they also build folk stories and communicate and tell the younger generations and Yakthung youths with very much translingual, oral, and transsemiotic ways. So that when we say Tongsing in Yakthung philosophy, it's like coming together. So where the people from all age groups and gender and social classes, so they all come together and then they listen to the elders and their stories. That's how this project was designed. So that's a praxis that begins with the action, and then and how it works is basically, this is just an example. So there is a long story. So long story short, so what happened is these youths actually go to forest and find out the plants that are actually that are important in community building, basically in performing cultural rituals. And they find those plants and bring to the land, and they dig the land and they plant all these plants. And what happens is each plant has a story. It's not just plant as a plant. It has a story that shapes the worldviews of the Yakthung indigenous people, right? For example, this is one plant which is called Tengoba, which translates as a bombax or the cotton tree. And so that is very kind of powerful plant, very important plant for the indigenous youth, but this is being more in danger because of deforestation. And the younger generation do not understand the value of this because this is not really taught in the textbooks. Now, what happened is you can see there are two versions of the story. So which basically talks about how human beings and the animals were created, right? So, and this is how, and this story is told by the elders when they talk about these plants. So the plant is not plant. So plant is very much epistemic resource for learning these indigenous youths, the language, and also the values, right? So I don't have time to read, but you can see there are two versions of this story, which one is more like translated into English, and the first one is more translingual, which includes both Nepali and English, because these youths actually do not understand everything told in Yakton. So they have more translingual stories here. So, but you can see how they are understanding these plans in multiple languages in a fluid manner. So the second project in the decolonial praxis is the project with teachers. I'll be very brief now. So which is called Identity Text Project, which builds on teacher participatory action research approach. So drawing on the idea of the Cummings and early 2011, here these students are so demotivated because these students come from very diverse background with very little and almost no family support. They don't have, most of them have migrated from different villages in the city, and they don't have really good family condition. So they are not really getting clue how to write and read and how to get success out of their school curriculum. So now what happened is here, I work with this student and still working with my student who teaches in this school, is how to help these students to write, to read, and more interested into learning. So what happened is we started with writing their own stories. So what happened is in this school, the students are really told and the students are taught in English only. So the teachers are told to teach everything in English. So that actually blocks the whole processes of the learning. So, but when we talked to head teacher and the teacher, my student, and then we started asking these students, so how do they, what they would like to write about? And they said, oh, they have really amazing story. And we started writing, asking them to write about their own stories in the languages they feel comfortable in writing. So they started writing in their own mother tongue, different indigenous languages, for example, Rai, Yaktung, Newar, even some other minoritized languages from the Madhya province, for example. So then we worked on their own stories, and they created multilingual dictionaries. And finally, they produce really interesting translingual and multimodal storybooks that they read in front of their class and other students. So then the second step of writing a grammar of decoloniality is questioning and unpacking language ideologies. So based on these praxis, we talked with the teachers, and it's called dialogue more, and also had a chumlung, which is meeting with the Yaktung parents and the students. And this is what they have to say. For example, English monolingualism is failing our students. It kills their creativity. So from the second project. And in school, we don't learn Yaktung. School only promotes Nepali and English, so I'm not learning anything about Yaktung. So that's what the student from the first project talks about, reflecting on his own experience. So basically, these students and teachers are unpacking how standard language ideology, monoglossism, monolingualism, and linguistic hierarchies are actually failing their students. And the third step is decolonial awareness, and building on the praxis, the project, the action. We have been really working on how we can build awareness of the teachers. So for example, and indigenous communities. For example, one of the teachers says, our education and training program have never taught us about the importance of children's home languages. Our indigenous languages are not used in the classroom. Schools are not promoting local languages and cultures. And then Yaktung elder from the first project said, like, oh, language is so important for our children. It's our cholung. Cholung is pride. But because of schools, they are not learning Yaktung. We need to change language and education policies. So you can see these elders are becoming more critical, and we do a lot of community meetings, which and chumlungs. The third steps is, of course, grassroots activism. So teachers are now advocating for using multilingual repertoire in their schools. Teachers are also resisting the institutional imposition of monolingual English-only policy. Indigenous Yaktung community members are collecting and lobbying and demanding with local government for multilingual education. They are organizing Yaktung literacy and cultural campaigns, for example. So my conclusion then is, as Alison Phipps argues, if we are going to do this, if we are going to decolonize multilingualism, let's do it as an attempt at a way of doing it. The only way to decolonize is to do it. So decolonizing multilingualism, as I have discussed, involves reorienting our understanding about and ways of teaching and learning language, not as a purely human-centric phenomenon, but a planetary relating to land, plant, water, animal, etc. phenomena. Decolonizing multilingualism for me is not a new phenomenon, but it's a life way of the people in the global South, like me. It's a matter of struggle for legitimizing our language practices and the epistemology associated with them. And to conclude, decolonizing multilingualism should start from the bottom up and by recognizing the life ways of the multilingual learners and speakers, as I have reported in these two projects. So thank you, Nogen.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Fayek, for that wonderful panel and talk. So illuminating and so important to hear the voices of the land and the land speaking and land-based pedagogy. And it was wonderful to hear the concrete examples of praxis and how we can learn from the land as well. So thank you again for sharing your expertise with us today. We really appreciate it. And last but not least, our next panelist is Dr. Patrianne Smith. Dr. Patrianne Smith holds the position of professor at the University of South Florida with a specialization in language and literacy. Her research emerges at the intersection of race, language, and immigration, and her scholarship is published broadly. She's the author of the books Black Immigrant Literacies, Intersections of Race, Language, and Culture in the Classroom, and Literacies of Migration, Translanguaging Imaginaries of Innocence. Thank you, Dr. Smith. Thank you for joining us today. We look forward to your talk, and I'll pass the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm very delighted to talk with everyone today. And my talk this afternoon, everyone, is titled Transracial Linguistics for the Reimagination of Post-Colonial Logics. I invite you at the beginning of this talk here to just journey with me briefly to Senegal. Senegal being a multilingual country in Africa, having at least 36 languages, but where Wolof is spoken very widely as one of the most popular languages, if not the most popular, but also where French is still an official language in this multilingual country. In this country where this individual, Ludovic, a French expat, took residence a year ago, Ludovic describes how he works fluently in Wolof to speak to the shopkeeper where he lives, Mustafa Diop, and is able to communicate in Wolof with this individual racialized as Black. Here you can see Baran working with Mustafa, discussing some groceries that he's purchasing. And Mustafa talks about how intriguing it is to see this Frenchman racialized as white in his community speaking Wolof fluently. It is surprising, he says, to see a Frenchman speak Wolof fluently because most French people who come from France to here only speak French. But for Baran, the idea here is that it helps with his adaptation. He says it helps to negotiate prices as well, to discover people, their language, to have good times. And he says, if I only spoke French, I couldn't meet people in the same way. And so here you can see Baran and his immersion into this neighborhood in Senegal. But you can also see Babakar, his friend that he has now been able to partner with to not just learn Wolof, but to present Wolof as a language online that many individuals can learn, whether they are racialized as Black across the diaspora or racialized as white. And so the sharing of this information about how to learn Wolof is now disseminated through this YouTube channel created by Baran and Babakar. Together, they create videos about how they can actually communicate their knowledge about language use and also how they can create a multilingual norm that is different. In the experiences of Babakar and Baran, I argue a transracial linguistic approach is visible. We can see how the individual learning of a language as a man racialized as white and who is easily associated with individuals responsible for the colonization of so many nations so many years ago is placed into connection with an individual racialized as Black, someone associated with the subjugation of so many people. And so in our time together today, I want to talk briefly about how a post-colonial present requires us to think with a transracial linguistic approach so that we can begin to reimagine post-colonial logics. For those interested in a number of the articles that would have inspired this work and the number and the varied lenses that I bring to this work, I invite you to take the QR code and to access the QR code as I go through the presentation. I come to this work as a Black Caribbean immigrant scholar, mother, educator. I tend to provide a lens that I use to come to this work because I think it provides an understanding of how decolonization of multilingualism for me stems out of a transnational ethos. It comes from my work as a former teacher in the Caribbean context, English-speaking Caribbean, formerly dominated by the Spanish, by the French, and by the British. But I also come to this work as someone who has lived and worked in the United States of America, engaging with quite a different sort of conundrum in a minority world nation as compared to the majority world context from which I originated in St. Lucia. In speaking about a post-colonial present, I focus a lot on how does the Caribbean lens allow us to see post-colonialism in specific ways, but also how does the colonial past exist in the colonial present? I come to this work by centering critical race theory because at the center of European domination was the idea of subjugating certain peoples based on notions such as ethnicity, immigration, language, and nationality, highlighted in the research of Kimberly Crenshaw on intersectionality. I come to this lens, as I mentioned earlier, by also thinking about the Caribbean pathway to decolonization or to thinking about decolonization and acknowledging that in the English-speaking Caribbean, where the dominant countries exercised their roles and their ways of doing and being and living together with others was determined to be the proper and acceptable way of engaging instructionally in schools and classrooms. I come to this work by thinking about how post-colonization is not necessarily post, as it really is still centering the kinds of norms that European subjects had leveraged in the past. And so in the English-speaking Caribbean, here we can see how low-status Englishes and how they function to reinforce the kinds of ways of delegitimizing the people that are associated or entangled with these Englishes while they reinforce a standardized English norm. Grappling with a colonial present, therefore, I argue, requires us to think of how the colonial past remains currently present in the ways that multilingual speakers of Englishes, as we saw in all of the presentations so far, are required to adapt to a sort of norm that is not their way of living in the world. Decolonization, therefore, in thinking about multilingualism, stems for me from a racial-linguistic perspective, where colonization is very much based on how racialization is connaturalized with race based on the research of Jonathan Rosa and Nelson Flores. How did the white European speaker define or describe how language should be used so many years ago? And how does this still get perpetuated as a racialized norm for individuals who are people of color? In fact, in thinking about how this happens, the important thing to keep in mind is that decolonizing multilingualism requires us to engage with the assumption that no matter how much effort individuals who are people of color tend to make to use certain kinds of linguistic practices, they will continue to have to prove over and over again that they are legitimate as well as the language that they use. This brings us to a transracial linguistic approach. I think about a transracial linguistic approach as a way of decolonizing multilingualism because it stems out of this thinking about critical race theory, but also more specifically, a racial linguistic perspective and the idea that the race and language connections that individuals have create ways of being and doing in the world that require us to not just engage with individuals, but as some of our presenters said earlier, to engage also with the systems. And so what is a transracial linguistic approach? A transracial linguistic approach describes what is at the same time between, across, and beyond disciplines, various representations of racial linguistics. We think about transracial linguistic approach based on how it emerged from the research with Black immigrant youth, Black immigrant teachers, Black immigrant educators. Avec et puis sans white gaze, which is French Creole, St. Lucian French Creole for with and without attention to the white gaze. And so in looking at the ways that these individuals thought about how they thought about race, in thinking about how they thought about culture, and in looking at how they thought about the ways that others and themselves thought about language, it was clear that metalinguistic, metacultural, metaracial understandings functioned as assets in the ways that these individuals engaged with the world. The racialized immigrant populations with whom I've worked, all speakers of Englishes, were able to engage with these forms of understandings, I call them the 3 M's, in ways that did not completely sacrifice their personhoods. They're able to demonstrate duality and flexibility and transcend the limitations that negative constructions placed on their interactions with Englishes and on the ways that they use these Englishes. The racialized students that I worked with demonstrated how they did this on a daily basis, but in different ways. They brought the assets, the transracial linguistic assets that would allow them to navigate the world successfully. But they also raised questions about how institutions and societies allow them to recognize these assets, to leverage these assets, to continue to develop these assets, and then to share opportunities with dominant peers or peers considered to be from dominant groups as ways of creating solidarity, bridging gaps across racial populations. And so here we have a representation of a transracial linguistic approach. You can see the permeable circle that encloses this space, but you can also see a triangle that is in the middle here, also permeable. And then at the center, the solidarity building mechanisms that a transracial linguistic approach necessarily invokes across racialized individuals of color and racialized individuals who are white. I want us to pay close attention to three elements of a transracial linguistic approach. The first is that the two individuals on the left, racialized as people of color, physically and literally represent racialized students or others who use the three M's to navigate literary practices, in interactions with others, both within institutions and the broader society. They also symbolically, though, represent the racialized linguistic and broader semiotic resources that are entangled with these students as a function of the context in which they exist, and which may position students along an inferior, superior spectrum of linguistic identity. If we think about the second element of a transracial linguistic approach that I'd like to highlight today, it has to do with people often racialized as white. In contrast to the other individuals mentioned earlier, the individual on the right who is racialized as white represents physically and literally, in contexts such as the US and Canada, a student from the dominant group, also able to adopt and leverage understandings with racialized students based on how they're affected by institutional and societal norms. This individual symbolically represents the linguistic and broader semiotic resources with which they also are entangled, but that create an inferior superior spectrum, which positions them at the positive end of the power dynamic. The third element that I'd like to point out in a transracial linguistic approach is space. The permeable equilateral triangle aptly denotes the transracial linguistic space where students are functioning with three key understandings: metalinguistic, metacultural, and metaracial. They are interacting with each other and they are impacted by institutional realities. The broad permeable circle, though, allows us to think about how other forms of understanding are also always becoming part of the conversation and becoming present. This circle, because it is permeable, allows us to think about the beyond, about revelatory parts of understandings that we may not yet know about, but that can reveal themselves through the process of interaction. The many entanglements, therefore, with racialized Englishes and with language that individuals who are white or people of color have are allowed to engage in this space together with various ways of demonstrating how power operates in the world. For those who are interested in the very specific orientations of a transracial linguistic approach, I invite you to take a look at Jada, who was a Black and transnational youth operating in the US, working on demonstrating her three M's, Chloe as well as Irvin. But as I try to wrap up, I want to just take our attention for a moment to thinking about what does this transracial linguistic approach mean for reimagining post-colonial logics? Well, if we think about a transracial linguistic approach, we want to think about it from a two-pronged mechanism, institutional and individual, as I mentioned earlier. The racial-linguistic perspective proposed by Jonathan Rosa and Nelson Flores describes just how race and language being connaturalized requires us not just to focus on the individual and how the individual is becoming capable of demonstrating their assets with language, but also how our institutions designed to delegitimize the ways in which individual people are making themselves visible in the world. I take us back now to Baran and to Babakar in thinking about a transverse linguistic approach. We see that Baran was able to actually individually leverage his capacity as a white French expat to demonstrate that he could engage with a language that had been subjugated by the British powers, or the French powers rather, and was able to use Wolof as a way of demonstrating that he would become capable of leveraging this linguistic practice in a way that caused others to wonder, well, how could he do this? But at the same time, we had Babakar with his meta-racial, meta-linguistic, meta-cultural sorts of understandings, able to transcend this notion of having to work with a white man and being able to realize that centering the Wolof language societally and institutionally was a way to get so many Senegalese populations to reclaim their capacity for demonstrating their multilingualism on a broad scale. In essence, this capacity of Baran and of Babakar to together work in solidarity across racial, linguistic, and cultural lines in the country of Senegal represents the kinds of ways in which a transracial linguistic approach is requiring us to operate. And so, as we wrap up, what I'd like to ask are a few questions about how we might revolutionize TESOL institutionally and individually by thinking about the notion of what I am calling translanguaging with Englishes. And the first question that I ask is, how do TESOL classrooms establish linguistic innocence for students of color that allow for the translanguaging with Englishes practices? And not just thinking about TESOL as teaching English to speakers of other languages, but teaching Englishes to speakers of other languages. What would it mean for speakers of color learning named Englishes in TESOL to be able to use metalinguistic, metacultural, metaracial understandings to center a multilingual, multicultural, and multiracial norm? And in what ways are students racialized as white in TESOL context able to also be part of learning this process of using the 3 M's so that they can create structures that allow them to engage with empowering the other populations with whom they interact? What would it mean, or what would it look like for TESOL to use Englishes as a basis for reconciliation through the 3 M's? I'm not able to go through quite a number of these mechanisms that I've presented in my book, but I wanted to just highlight that there are many ways in which we can do this at the institutional level. There are also many ways in which we can do this at the individual level, enabling students of color, as so many of our examples from the previous presentations have shown, to reclaim the multilingual practices that students have. And so I urge us to take a look at some of the books and some of the ways in which these practices are being made manifest. Many authors are actually writing about these. And I'm just so very grateful to be able to join this conversation, and invite you to reach out to me if you do have any questions about a transracial linguistic approach. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so, so much, Dr. Smith. What a wonderful, important, and inspiring presentation. I really enjoyed, I was taking notes as well, translational linguistics as a way to address the colonial present. I love the way you've emphasized that it's still ongoing today, and also its potential for solidarity building, which is also vital for decolonizing multilingualism, TESOL, and language education more broadly. So thank you so, so much for sharing your expertise with us today. Right, so I'm looking at the time. So we do have some time, but before I do that, I just want to, well, take a moment to thank our panelists again for sharing such wonderful, awe-inspiring talks today, really important insights into diverse contexts, suggestions and implications from each of the panelists' work for how can we decolonize multilingualism going forward. And one common theme that really stood out was the importance of place and space as well, and exemplifying how language is not disconnected from language and language practices, from the spaces, the places, and the land in which we reside, and we're not disconnected from each other as well. So lots of inspiring work being done, and so I'm incredibly grateful to you all for your time and for joining us today. What I'm going to do for the Q&A, I do realize that we don't have much time, so I'm going to stop the recording part of that. So thank you everyone as well here who's joining us today. We are really grateful to you all, and thank you for your time. So I'll stop the recording